Here's the 30-second lesson on what legends know. Never practice nunchucks in a crowded room. Never eat chole before a road trip. Always take your shirt off before you iron it. Don't take a call near a swimming pool. And don't forget, saving is not investing. Legends don't just save, they invest in mutual funds. Mutual fund investments are subject to market risks. Read all scheme-related documents carefully.
The humble popcorn is having its moment in the sun or maybe in the oven, in the microwave. It's caused such a controversy because of the way GST has been levied on it, depending on whether it's salted, it's caramelized, salted and caramelized. You've been watching all of that. You will also see a couple of tweets as I speak on your screen, giving you the details. What's happened after this is that the finance minister herself tried to clarify this. And then, once these things start, they acquire a momentum and fuel of their own, because then many other questions came up about the GST and about complexities in the GST. So let me say this at the outset. GST, which was called good and simple tax, it has many complexities and it was done in a hurry. There was a midnight session of parliament planned. So it was like a deadline. You can always say that without a deadline, such a thing would not have happened. You could have gone into analysis paralysis. Nevertheless, a GST was done. It's worked generally all right, but anomalies keep coming up. But as time passes, more and more complexities are coming into this, and this popcorn is probably the most telling metaphor for these complexities. So let me start this episode of Cut the Clutter with two famous quotes from who else but Sir Humphrey Appleby. You remember, the civil servant from Yes Minister. So the two quotes are, first of all, important one, and you could start with this: civil servants have an extraordinary genius for wrapping up a simple idea to make it sound extremely complicated. Now, this whole popcorn business, the whole thing could have been taxed as one. The whole thing could have been taxed at 5%, 10%, 18% would have been too much. But that would have resolved this problem. And if this is being done with popcorn, you can imagine it's being done with many such things, because you know what? Bureaucracies love complexity. Bureaucracies love complexity because from there, bureaucracies draw their power, because complexity means there are layers to lift. Complexities mean issues will come to bureaucracies and they will then have discretion. They can see something as this or a little bit as this, and that will make a big difference. So discretion then increases friction between the citizen and the state. And it would be surprising and disappointing if Modi government let this happen in the case of GST, or lets this fester in the case of GST, because Modi government actually has done a remarkable job in reducing friction between the citizen and the state, particularly at the lowest level of income. So now the poorest Indians are getting their food grain, they are getting that PM Kisan, they are getting their house building money, subsidies, etc., all in their bank accounts, without any friction with the state, which was the bane of Indian citizenry earlier, or the poor Indian earlier. Now with the Jam Trinity, it's all sorted out. In that situation, to let these complexities fester is not something that Modi government would want. However, such is the nature of bureaucracies. Just as I quoted from Sir Humphrey Appleby, civil servants have an extraordinary genius for wrapping up a simple idea to make it sound extremely complicated. So instead of one popcorn, you have many popcorns. In fact, I am surprised that so far no cartoonist has latched onto the line of one nation, one popcorn, please. Right? Isn't it tempting? It's just that I don't have any talent at drawing a cartoon, or maybe I would have done it. Now, the finance minister came out to explain this, and her explanation had substance, because she said if popcorn is sold only with salt on it, it's sold as a namkeen. Once you caramelize it, it becomes a mithai. So, and taxation is different, GST is different on namkeen and on mithai. So far so good, but for just popcorn, if you go into such detail, you can tie yourself in knots. So what happens tomorrow if somebody has caramelized but sugar-free popcorn, which means you can use stevia or Splenda or aspartame or anything to sweeten it, then what happens? Does it go into a very different category? In fact, I might be floating some dangerous ideas, and somebody sitting up there in this vast bureaucratic machinery might think, Arey, how come we missed that point? So there should be yet another category. So the finance minister tried to explain it, but as she explained it, it doesn't look like it convinced anybody. Her point, her distinction she made between mithai and namkeen, that if you put sugar on it, it becomes mithai. Until you keep it only with salt, it remains namkeen. That's a sound point. But these explanations don't really help, because then other stuff started about GST on used cars, etc., because a lot of complexity has come into GST. And now it's become very difficult for those charging GST or paying GST and all these input, output, credit business. So far, so good. It started out all right with its flaws, but now it looks like a lot of reform is called for within GST because it has become much too complicated. So the second quote from Humphrey Appleby is also relevant here, and this is following the finance minister's clarification. And that quote is, as if it was written for this exact situation: clarification is not to clarify things, it is to put oneself in the clear. So in this case, it looks like it's the same bureaucracy that designed this complexity is now trying to put itself in the clear. That'll be the popular perception even with this clarification. And you can see where criticism has come from. Criticism has also come from circles considered to be close to this government or those that are fans of this government. So there is TV Mohandas Pai, formerly of Infosys, now an investor in his right and also quite a public debater. He's spoken out, and see what he's saying. See TV Mohandas Pai's tweet. He says, "This is silly and complex, will lead to tax terrorism. Citizens are becoming victims of bad policy, which will make them hostages to rent-seeking officials and create disputes. GST needs to be simplified." So I don't think there can be much dispute with that. You need a simplification of GST. It's been around for many years now, and all these complexities have come into it. The other criticism has come from the former chief economic advisor to this government, Krishnamurthy Subramaniam, who is now India's representative at the IMF. And he makes a calculation. He says, if you look at the estimated popcorn sales in India, and these are from global data, estimated popcorn sales in India, there will be about 1,700 crores in 2025. The estimated GST collection for 2025 is 22 lakh crores. That is 22 trillion rupees. If you tax all of the popcorn sale, that is 1,700 crores worth, at 18%, that is at the highest rate, you will still earn only 300 crores. That is 0.013% of your overall GST collection. So is it then worth it to create this complexity within complexity within complexity? And then he goes on to say, complexity is a bureaucrat's delight and citizens' nightmare. So criticism has come from this government's own as well. Besides the critics, of course, they will criticize. Now, in this episode of Karta Clutter, you will see a fair bit of opinion. So be warned. Because what is reform in India? Reform in India is basically the government shrinking. It is exactly what Donald Trump is trying to do with his DOGE. He wants to shrink the size of his government. It's a slogan that Narendra Modi had before the 2014 election. That is, minimum government, maximum governance. So smart people around the world, smart leaders around the world are shrinking their government. Donald Trump has set up this group under Elon Musk and Vivek Ramaswamy. This is a very powerful group, and they are already identifying areas where they say they are going to cut the size of the government. Also, another global hero right now among those who believe in less government and those who happen to be libertarian or who happen to be more free market oriented or who want government to have less of a role in our lives. Their hero is Javier Milei in Argentina, who's doing many remarkable things. He had said that he'll cut his ministries by half, which he has done. Others say take the axe to tax. In this case, he took the axe to the government and he cut it into half. Now, those are the ones that are carrying out real reform and cutting the size of the government and taking the government out of our lives. Does it happen in India? Can it happen in India? Or do you get the sense that over the past few years, in fact, we see more government in Delhi, I see more bhavans coming up. You go through any process, particularly in banks, despite digitization, so many times you have to again send photocopies of your Aadhaar card, your PAN card, and also attest them. Now, I know in some corner of every bank, all this stuff must be piling up. What use that is for anybody, I don't know, because all your bank accounts are already linked to your Aadhaar and your PAN number. Without that, you can't have a bank account. Then why again these photocopies every time? But these are things that bureaucracies do, at which point, after using two famous lines from Sir Humphrey Appleby, I will quote to you one from Ramnath Goenka, late Ramnath Goenka, the founder of the Indian Express. He used to say in a very different context, in a sort of self-deprecatory, mischievous context. And if you knew him better, then maybe it was not so self-deprecatory, it was more to tell you how his mind worked. He said, my mind works in such a complex way that if you hammer a nail from one side, it will come out of the other as a screw. आप कील यहाँ से ठोकोगे तो वो पेच बन के निकलेगा. Now, this is what happens sometimes when simple ideas go through complex bureaucracies, because they like to complicate things. Some of that seems to be happening now with GST as well. Now, if I take you back to pre-reform India, I will give you two stories from pre-reform India. And both the participants in that story are around, and I think they've written about it and they've spoken about it in public in a couple of times in discussions with me, also at book releases, etc. So this is N.K. Singh, who's now also a key figure with this government. But in the era of the first reform, was a key figure, also a key player in the reform process as a senior civil servant. So N.K. Singh, then he had his upbringing in the Commerce Ministry in the license control era, and also Montek Singh Ahluwalia, who was Finance Secretary under Dr. Manmohan Singh. So two reforms were carried out, and I will tell you why. Until 1991, as an Indian, if you went overseas, you could not use your Indian credit card. Your credit card came with a line saying valid only in India and Nepal, because in Nepal, Indian currency is valid. You can use Indian currency as much as you can use Nepalese currency. Anywhere else you went, you could not use an Indian credit card. So I, as a reporter, when I had to travel overseas, sometimes I had to rent a car. I could not rent a car because nobody would rent a car to you if you did not have a credit card. So very often I had to find a friend who would stand guarantee on his credit card so I could rent a car. Of course, I paid my friend, but I did not have a credit card, and that's a problem that everybody had. Now that is something that N.K. Singh and Montek tell you, that they would go to fund bank meetings in the US or meetings at the UN, and they would find that somebody from the embassy would have to come and check them in, because they would not have credit cards that would just allow them a simple check-in, even if they were paying their bills differently. Because without taking a charge on your credit card, most hotels would not check you in. So that became one thought for a reform, and that reform came soon enough. The second thing, this is something that I think N.K. Singh has also written in one of his books. Entering a lift in Geneva at one of these multilateral meetings again, they figured that the lift was smelling of petrol. And the immediate thought was, some Indians must have used this lift earlier. Now, many in today's generation would find this very odd, because they would not know that until about 3 decades ago, all of our clothes were dry cleaned, not in today's modern dry cleaning machines, but in machines that actually used petrol. So your freshly laundered or dry cleaned clothes came out smelling of petrol, and they smelled of petrol for a long time. In fact, by the time the smell of petrol ended, it was time to get them dry cleaned again. So the reason this was still going on was that in India, the import of non-petrol using dry cleaning machines was banned. So these gentlemen came back and the whole process started. That was the era of reform, and that ban was lifted and modern dry cleaning machines started coming in. As you can figure out, it's also very environment friendly. It does not release that much carbon because it's not burning that much fossil fuels, and it's also not letting out all that used stuff as effluents in your water supply, in your soil, etc. So this is how these reforms were carried out. And you now look back and think that it's the same bureaucracy empowered by the political class to do so that had spun this very complex web. And it took some really smart people to cut through this and to bring in some clarity in the situation. In fact, just after the first round of reforms, I do remember landing in Delhi from some foreign visit and customs officers. And in that informal conversation, I said, now your workload must be much less because passengers are allowed to bring a lot more. So many restrictions have been lifted. You don't have to search everybody's baggage, etc., unless you really suspect somebody of being a smuggler. And one of them said, no, sir. Ye do sardar hai na, the 2-6, that is Manmohan Singh and Montek Singh Ahluwalia, दो सरदार है ना, ये देश की इंडस्ट्री को बेचना चाहते हैं. They want to destroy, sell out India's industry and India's manufacturing. We will not allow this to happen. We are patriotic Indians, so we checked everybody, which means we want to keep our right to give all passengers trouble. There was such nostalgia about the power which had now been taken away. And that is how reform works. So I will take you back again to something that Dr. Manmohan Singh said on 22nd January 2007 in the Prime Minister's house. He released P. Chidambaram's first book, the first collection of his column at the Indian Express. And speaking there, and you can find this speech on the Prime Minister's office website. I'm also sharing a link with you. You will also see this passage on your screens. He said, and I'm quoting the key para because it is so relevant to today's situation, to the complexities that have arisen where there should have been none. And these complexities have arisen because the size of the government has become big or has not been made smaller or has not been shrunk or cut to size as the DOGE project or Javier Milei are trying to do in the US and Argentina. In India, it's gone the other way. So what did Dr. Manmohan Singh say? It's so relevant. He said, and I quote, even the most ardent reformers find it difficult to obliterate their own empires of power and patronage. Reform means obliterating your own empire of power and patronage. But that is what Chidambaram did as Commerce Minister. I think he was one of the few ministers who presided over shrinking his own ministry, disproving the usual notion of political economy that all politicians and bureaucrats aim to expand their personal empires. He closed down sections of the ministry that had been rendered redundant by the trade and industry policies we had initiated. So real reform means cutting down the size of your own empires and also curtailing your own power. But once you bring in the possibility of discretion, because now somebody will figure out what popcorn it was. Popcorn is just a metaphor. It's a very small thing. But when this kind of sort of absurd distinctions come in, then discretion follows. And discretion means friction. Friction means leakage of taxes, evasion at the least worst end, and corruption at the worst end. In fact, that's the point we make in our 50-word edit today. Please read that edit on your screens. It's the GST Council's latest meeting has further complicated an already torturous tax system. Tax rates on food items vary based on location, price, specific ingredients, and sometimes even temperature. This encourages evasion and increases discretion of tax officials meant for ease of doing business. GST is boomeranging on the idea. Civil servants actually have a very tough job, very challenging job, and if they do it sincerely, quite a thankless job because they are paid very moderately, they have to work very long hours. I know all this debate about 70 hours a week, etc., etc. Most civil servants who take their work seriously do work that kind of hours. It might be 5-day week, but most of them end up working more than 5 days. They work long hours every day as well. However, their job is not to take decisions. The job of taking decisions is with the minister. So I'll bring back to you a conversation that took place in 2003. In 2003, this was a farewell dinner that Brajesh Mishra had given for the outgoing US Ambassador, Robert Blackwell. Robert Blackwell was a professor at Harvard. He was going back now. The dinner took place sort of coincidentally or probably even serendipitously on the day when National Interest had come out. It was a Saturday. National Interest had come out criticizing the Indian Foreign Service, because remember that was the foreign service which had cut its teeth in the Cold War era, right from recruitment to maybe reaching the secretary level. Most of their working life was spent in the Cold War era. They were finding it very difficult to adjust to Vajpayee government's tilt to the US and mothballing of the Indira Nehru era socialist, non-aligned, generally skeptical of America foreign policy. So there was a struggle in India. That is what I had called out in National Interest that morning, and I think it was headlined Indian Fossil Service for IFS. So two former foreign secretaries, in fact three former foreign secretaries were also among the invitees. Two of them attacked me as I walked in. One, J.N. Dikshit, who later became National Security Advisor, he did not. The other two did. Most of all, Mr. M.K. Raskotra, whose 100th birthday we just celebrated. That little argument also became a fire starter. So Brajesh Mishra said that I get sometimes so frustrated with my MEA, with South Block, that I want to call the army chief to request him to send me a regiment of tanks, which I can send on South Block to demolish the MEA, because they don't want any change in anything. They resist everything. Robert Blackwell at the other end of the table leaned forward and he said, Brajesh, in fact he used to say Bragesh, so he said, Bragesh, can I make a request to you? Before you send that regiment of tanks on South Block, can I borrow it from you? I want to send it on Foggy Bottom because I have the same problem. And then a conversation started about civil services, career civil servants and politicians. And Robert Blackwell said that, look, I'm a professor at Harvard. I teach governance. And this is how I explain bureaucracies and civil services and politicians to my students. That think of a government like a big hospital. In the hospital, there is an emergency room, emergency ward. When a patient is wheeled in, emergency room staff does what they are supposed to do, which is following standard operating procedures, SOPs, and then they wait for specialists to come in the morning or when the hospital opens. They are your civil servants. Civil servants are supposed to follow standard operating procedures. Then in the morning, the specialists come and they decide what the course of treatment should be. They carry out surgeries and so on and so forth. Those are the politicians in a government system. So civil servants are like people in the emergency ward, the staff in the emergency ward, the doctors, the nurses, the paramedics, the technicians, and the politicians are like the specialists. So if the politicians stop deciding, problem arises, because if the politicians or the specialists stop deciding or stop being absent at work, then too much power goes into the hands of those who are only supposed to follow standard operating procedures, and that causes distortions. And finally, my favorite author, late P.J. O'Rourke, he used to travel across the world and find interesting things and write these big, funny but serious travelogues. So he came to India and he was traveling through India in 1998 when the Vajpayee government tested our nuclear weapons and announced that India was a nuclear weapons power. Now P.J. O'Rourke is reflecting on that in his own madcap way because he's just had his big trouble with Indian customs, etc. So he raises a question rhetorically that should the Americans worry that India might fire an ICBM at them? And he says, if India tried to launch an ICBM, the missile would have to stop on its way someplace, maybe even in Karachi, while a team of Indian customs agents looked up warhead exportation in a great big book, right? That is the reputation of Indian bureaucratic system. You will find it in his book, CEO of the Sofa. This is not about individual civil servants. Individual civil servants, actually good civil servants get into trouble because politicians don't take responsibility for their actions. We have the example of H.C. Gupta, the former Court Secretary, whose ministers, everybody got away, and while he's been charged with no money making, not even a rupee, he's had several jail sentences thrown at him. So good civil servants suffer in the system. They don't benefit from this system. This system benefits those in the bureaucracy who thrive in complexity. That's why India also needs a process, a bit like the DOGE process in America or Javier Milei. Maybe that's too radical, but this was the original promise of Narendra Modi. Minimum government, maximum governance. The way GST is now sort of becoming more complex, it does not look like a very good advertisement for minimum government.